If we're applying all those pedantic, arbitrary rules critics use to fruitlessly rank the subjective quality of a film, Danny and Michael Philippou's psychological possession horror Bring Her Back may not be the best of anything when ranked against other films on my 2025 list, but upon reflection, what truly helped to solidify it as my personal favourite of the year was the profoundly pungent presence that's lingered with me ever since I saw it. Admittedly, while I was very positive in my initial reaction, I was going through some personal hardships that left me so emotionally exhausted with grief and trauma as topics that I somewhat stubbornly resisted the catharsis I typically find in stories like this. However, fitting to the film's themes, with time and healing, I grew ever more enamored and appreciative of the film's ambition, as it kept shadowing over every other film I thought would make the #1 spot. Heck, even if a film is flawed by said ambition, by default I often find myself drawn to it anyhow, over functionally safe experiences that pander to close-minded expectations that are too afraid to be creatively challenged. Call it snobby, but since this video will inevitably spark another vapid debate about the best art of the year, that's the hill I'm willing to die on. I'd rather a film take an audacious swing rather than undermine itself with a whimper. Anyway, while some of you fight me in the comments, Bring Her Back tells the story of two step-siblings called Andy and Piper, who after the sudden death of their father are rehomed with a grieving mother called Laura and her seemingly mute nephew Oliver. However, as luck would inevitably have it, it soon becomes clear that Laura is in the midst of performing a ghoulish demonic ritual in the hopes of resurrecting her untimely deceased daughter Kathy, who drowned in the garden pool several months prior. In the words of Andy, what ensues is a bleak and truly ugly psychological ordeal as Andy attempts to process his own trauma while contending with Laura's increasingly dangerous and abusive behaviour. Now, to quickly summarise my feelings, what specifically made Bring Her Back so impactful for me over time was its perfect combination of both poignancy and terror. On the one hand, there's the incredible intelligence and tenderness buried deep beneath the putrid rot that erodes the human spirit during our most desperate and devastating moments, and on the other, there's the brilliantly enigmatic underworld of unspeakable demonic horrors which cleverly ties back into the Raka Raka brothers' previous debut film Talk to Me. Consistent with Talk to Me, Bring Her Back is a film about the malignance of both grief and trauma, and the corrosion it has on everything we touch if we continue to let it fester and consume our ability to move on. So if you're ready to venture down this bitterly bleak road to a thoughtfully fitting climax, you know what they say, grapefruit. Bring Her Back opens with a powerfully grotesque symbolic visualization that demonstrates the startling monkey's paw twist behind the resurrection ritual that gradually unfolds. We briefly witness found footage of a grossly agonized reanimated fetus with the word cult written upside down, while a text prompt broodingly warns us that this is not a cult. Not only is this emblematic of the film's appropriately vague and ambiguous supernatural elements that leave you, much like Laura, to piece together your own understanding of the spell, but it ties into the insidiously inverse nature of its evil. This is not a cult because this is not a demon one should worship. I will get into the harrowing specifics later, but for now, you come to understand that part of this ritual involves summoning a ravenous demon called Tari that the bereaved believe will help them bring their loved one back from the dead. And while yes, the tape Laura uses as a literal tutorial prove this to be true, their grief blinds them to the inherently nefarious, greedy, and bastardized nature of the demonic occult. It cements in the back of your mind, or at least for me, that whatever delusional hope Laura has for bringing back her daughter inevitably is not going to be the fresh, glowing, transcendently angelic reawakening her faith paints it to be. If you're familiar with Talk to Me, which serves as a perfect companion piece, the Philippou brothers, or Raka Raka if you're familiar with their audacious YouTube videos, are unapologetically grim and matter-of-fact in their depiction of death. It's cold, desperate, degrading, depraved, immoral, and simply undignified. The brothers have stated that both their films exist in the same universe, so the logic is consistent, if indeed suitably open to interpretation, to strengthen its power as an incomprehensible threat that we will all one day face when we meet our own demise. I will confidently say they have solidified one of the most terrifying modern visions of where we go when we die. In fact, I don't see Talk to Me and Bring Her Back as direct allusions to hell, but rather an overcrowded purgatorial holding pen where the fate of the soul is yet to be decided. During the siblings' father's funeral, Laura comments that the soul stays in the body for months after death, which to me explains not only the urgency for Laura to complete her ritual, but also the violent restlessness of the spirits in both films as they constantly fight their way out of their painful and forgotten solitary confinement. By provocatively visualizing the ritual as fiercely ugly and macabre, it puts the main theme in perspective of how unholy and unnatural resurrection ultimately is, as was previously portrayed in Stephen King's 1983 novel Pet Sematary. In many ways, Bring Her Back is deeply indebted to this brutally dark story given the similarities in how they de-romanticize resurrection. I covered Pet Sematary many years ago, so if you want to see the full overview, go check out that video, but generally speaking, Stephen King wrote Pet Sematary around the experience of teaching his daughter about the certainty of death and the acceptance we have to embrace towards it. Pet Sematary's main theme about the inescapable ubiquity of death is essentially consolidated in one haunting quote by the protagonist's neighbor that "sometimes dead is better," which echoes through when the story sees the protagonist resurrect his young son, only to find out a different kind of malevolence has returned instead. In the case of Bring Her Back, it confronts us with the blunt notion that regardless of how unfair and untimely death is, the only way out of the vicious cycle of grief is to accept it. In fact, in an interview with Den of Geek, the Philippou brothers note that the motif of circles to retain the spell from breaking was basically a symbol for said cycle of grief. During pre-production, they explain how their cousin lost their 2-year-old, and the thought of her discovering her child was so visceral and haunting that the brothers could not escape the notion of what that would do to a parent, and subsequently how far they would be willing to go to undo what they felt was unjust. I've said it before, but one of the saddest phrases I've ever heard is that no parent should ever have to live to see their own child die, and by bottling that overwhelming, incomprehensible fear, it doesn't so much justify Laura's actions, but empathetically provide a complex reasoning to why she goes down the dark path that she does. The thing is, it's reductive to simply call her a crazed psychopath. It's evident she's had a nervous breakdown of sorts and is in dire need of help. But she is fully conscious of her decisions, and while she does lapse in emotional impulse, she is very meticulous in her plotting of her motivations. For as fucked up as it is, given the Philippou brothers' dark sense of humor and irony, Bring Her Back is ultimately a story about love and how far we're willing to go to hold on to it, regardless of the scorched earth levels of devastation we're willing to inflict on others to ensure its survival. Dare I say, the film echoes the very same sentiment shared by Osgood Perkins when he made Longlegs, which again I covered in a full video if you want the entire context, but I want to bring up a point I made in that video which involves final act spoilers, so jump to here if you're still planning to watch Longlegs. In the final act of Longlegs, it's revealed that the protagonist detective's mother is working for the titular villain Longlegs in service of the devil to help murder random families, otherwise Longlegs threatens to kill her daughter. As such, not only is the mother a victim in all of this, but Perkins told IndieWire that he doesn't see the mother's actions as morally questionable because as a parent, what she does is a necessary evil to protect her daughter. If we take that same logic and apply it to Laura in Bring Her Back, yes, she acts out of immoral and wrongful selfishness, but it's all in the favor of giving her daughter a second life after she was prematurely robbed of her first. Again, like I said earlier, it's not saying she's right, it's simply providing her with an empathetic, if unhealthy, rationale. In the same way Talk to Me was a possession allegory for drug addiction that's aggravated by grief, here we have another possession allegory where failing to take accountability for your grief before it consumes you can also have the potential ability to harm those within your bubble and beyond. Now, to give you context as to how Piper and Andy cruelly end up in Laura's path of destruction, it all begins after Andy discovers his father dead in the shower following complications with chemotherapy, and their social worker, who is friends with Laura, attempts to rehouse them at different locations. Acting as a father figure for his partially sighted sister, Andy plans to apply for guardianship of Piper once he turns 18, insisting that the social worker keep them together despite Laura's reluctance. As such, with Andy's existence being completely irrelevant to the ritual process, Laura immediately shows passive-aggressive resentment towards him and deploys psychological mind games to tear the step-siblings apart by gaslighting Piper into thinking Andy is troubled and unfit, while Andy is made to feel useless, invisible, and unwanted, reflecting his prior relationship with his father and the trauma he exhibits. What is so grimly distinct about Andy's storyline is that it's not simply beyond tragic, but it borders on nihilistic, because despite his natural fallibility, he genuinely does try to do everything in his power to protect his vulnerable sister, only to be beaten by Laura at practically every turn. Now, quick side note, it's never explained, but one could possibly make the argument that Andy's futility is a product of the salt spell surrounding the house that blurs the reality of how much of what's going on is in any character's control, particularly Laura. It is this unique volatility that makes the ritual process so perpetually distressing, because Laura is frankly dealing with powers she does not understand. Unlike many horrors centered around a domineering personality, what makes Laura so distinct is that she's ultimately a vulnerable character in her own right. She still has abusive parental control over the siblings, but she isn't omnipotent or a spell-casting mastermind, and that is what fundamentally makes her so incredibly dangerous. She is ultimately fallible to her dire emotional state. She displays complete ignorance, impulse, arrogance, and unpredictability, whilst in control of a time-sensitive spell involving a hungry fucking demon. Remember, she is literally following a Russian video tutorial she found on the dark web, and if you sleuth the viral marketing website made for the film, which includes the haunting tapes, you can actually read these 4chan-like comments that strongly imply Laura has been asking for help as if the demon was summoned without an instruction manual. It is so chef's kiss wonderfully within the Raka Raka brothers' sense of humor that it made me weirdly feel pity for Laura's boomer ignorance, while strongly adding to the world building established in Talk to Me, where certain corners of the world just casually accept the existence of demons. What is so significant about the Philippou brothers' storytelling is that there is no hint of pretense. In both films, the innocuous use of the dark web, social media, and the blatancy of dangerous trends fit firmly within the millennial cultural sensibilities they were both raised under. Everything they place in their world comes from a real, authentic place. They're both incredibly introspective and self-aware, and their personalities are so deeply embedded within the framework of their films that what they put out there is undeniably their creation. Anyway, just before we get to the demonic climax, let's return to Andy, who midway into the story admits to Laura his delinquency and troubled behaviour, where he cried to be noticed by his negligent father, who repeatedly beat Andy in the shower and used the hose to muffle the noises from Piper. As such, it left Andy traumatised by showers, which are further triggered and imposed upon him via the ceaseless heavy rain, as he also reveals he once hit Piper out of jealousy for never receiving the same abusive treatment. Ever since that mistake, Andy lives to atone for his regrets and become the healthy father figure to Piper that his father wasn't to him. As such, when he's first introduced to us, he's on a steady road to self-improvement, before Laura comes along and leverages this knowledge to push Andy towards a nervous breakdown by weaponizing his trauma to make him and Piper doubt his mental health. For example, it is strongly implied that Laura is constantly drugging his protein powder with sleeping pills so that she can spill urine on him in his sleep to force him into confronting the shower, which he refuses as the trauma increasingly weighs over him. However, Laura's fallibility and manipulation soon comes to bite her on the ass when she takes Piper into town to groom her as the new vessel for her daughter, leaving Andy alone to disobey her command to keep the ravenous and seemingly frail Olive Oliver locked in his room. By this point, many will have deduced that the demon Tari is currently possessing Oliver, and the longer Laura ignorantly keeps Tari in Oliver's body, the more dangerously restless and hangry he becomes. This is vividly demonstrated in an earlier scene where Laura briefly glimpses the true form of the creature, which mirrors that of a Wendigo, which according to the comments on blackangeltapes.net, Laura is just asking for trouble for not speeding up the resurrection process. Again, she is completely clueless about what she's doing without the help of the videotape, as is the case in the film's most notorious scene when Andy feeds Oliver a piece of fruit that just so happens to be on the edge of a kitchen knife, causing the demon to mutilate Oliver's mouth in attempting to eat said knife. After Andy unknowingly drags a resistant Oliver outside the boundary of the property's salt circle, Oliver breaks down in agony and begins convulsing, soon breaking him from the demon's possession until Laura follows the ritual from the tape and regains control of the situation. It's at this point I should explain how the ritual is in theory supposed to work. Basically, the caster summons the demon to possess a human vessel, in this case being Oliver, that must then devour the remains of the deceased you wish to resurrect, that being Kathy, and then purge the remains into the body of the new host, who must be killed in the same manner as the deceased, which for Laura means drowning Piper in the pool. This is audaciously reinforced by the videotapes themselves that boldly imply the resurrection of a fetus and a suicide by hanging, cementing how ugly and unromantic the ritual ultimately is. The story culminates in Laura hitting Piper and using Andy's troubled history to frame him, leading Andy to confront the social worker, but not before discovering that Oliver is actually a missing child called Connor Bird, who was abducted by Laura. During this, the demon grows restless, waiting to feast on Kathy's corpse, and raids the fridge like I do after a drunken night out, before attacking Laura. Very soon after, Andy and the social worker arrive at the house and confirm Andy's harrowing allegations. However, upon attempting to leave, both of them are suddenly and unceremoniously killed by Laura. It's a brutally ironic kick in the balls because it hits hard with the reality that life simply is ugly and unfair, as Andy always saw it, as he agonizingly meets his end after being drowned in a puddle. Andy doesn't get his redemption, or in fact is able to protect Piper, grimly cemented when she returns home to find his body, begging him to wake up. Yet, despite how dire the situation is, not all hope is lost. Going back to Pet Sematary, King's cynical ending sees the actions of the protagonist as being too late to turn back, whereas the Philippou brothers guide the story towards a bittersweet form of healing. While gruelingly attempting to drown Piper, Piper screams out to her mom, triggering happy memories of her late daughter, realizing that she has come to love Piper as she did Kathy. Laura has a sudden change of heart and Piper is able to escape free along with Connor as the demon leaves his body and he agonizingly returns to normal. The thing is, I genuinely expected Bring Her Back to go the whole mile and end in utter bleakness by committing to the inevitable monkey's paw ritual. However, in choosing to have Laura release her grief in those climactic moments, shows her humanity is not totally lost. That's not to say she's redeemed, of course. Seeing her dig into the open wound in her wrist and cradling her daughter in the pool suggests to me that she chooses to bleed out and bathe eternally in her grief, perhaps hoping to be reunited with her daughter in death. Yet for Piper and Connor, while they are inevitably scarred by their traumatic ordeal, there is hope in their long road to recovery. And with that, thank you so much for watching. Until next time, stay safe, stay away from grapefruit, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye.